In complete silence, Trump and Jesus walk into a bar. It's one of those classic bars. Just a few tables, round wooden tabletops, wooden chairs. It's dimly lit, and together they quietly progress through the bar to the corner. They sit down, still quiet, order a couple of beers, and then Donald begins to talk. Donald talks incessantly. He begins by praising Jesus, describing Jesus' disciples as good people, and that he's enamored by the tremendous work that Jesus is doing. But soon the stories shift to himself as he then begins to unfold for Jesus all his achievements, what he's done, the great person he is, the impact he's had on others. And this goes on for about an hour. Inexplicably, Trump pauses. And when he pauses, Jesus leans forward and looks at him in the eye, gently, but with a sense of inquisitiveness, and asks Donald, "Where's the compassion?" Trump's not sure how to respond to this, so he responds in the only way he knows how. He begins to talk again. So he talks and he talks and he talks. But this time, after only about 5 or 10 minutes, he pauses again. And Jesus repeats the question, "Where's the compassion?" They sit there in silence. Then both stand up to leave the room. They take a few steps towards the door. Jesus turns to him and gives Trump a big hug. And poor Donald, he doesn't know what to do with this. But he's silent. And then they leave the room. Nothing else is said. Now, this story for me is important at a number of levels because it has within it a really important tension. And it's worth exploring that tension a little bit now before we look at the gospel story for Sunday. The tension in many ways is a difference between two styles. On the one hand, you have Donald's style. It's the style of the emperor. It reflects a theology of entitlement, of self-importance. As an example of that, you just have to go back to Trump's inauguration speech of 2016. I know it wasn't written by Trump, but in many ways it captures the spirit of Trump's presidency. It reiterates those themes of self-importance. There's also an element of the messianic that Trump is going to fulfill all the unfulfilled hopes and aspirations of the American people. In many ways it reads, though, more like a theology rather than a political statement, and it's a theology of entitlement. In contrast, we have the practice of Jesus, empathic, thoughtful. It's about making connection. And above all, it's about a politics of compassion. Love is central in the Christian gospel. And if it means anything, if it means the more just a word of piety or nice things or some kind of ornament, it's about a practice of compassion and justice. And on that note, it stands in marked contrast to the style and the behaviour of Trump. Now, in fairness to Trump, we could have used any one of a number of the world leaders, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Erdogan, as a range of leaders who behave like emperors. And the critical thing about emperors is that there's only one person that the emperor is concerned about, and that's himself. In contrast with the politics of Jesus, this politics of compassion, the concern is not directed to himself, but it's to the community, to building community, a community that is inclusive of everyone. Now, this tension which I've been unpacking surfaces in the gospel reading which is used on Sunday. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21. It's the classic account some of you would have enacted the story decades ago at Sunday school. It's the triumphal entry. It's Palm Sunday. There are palms, all that sort of thing. It's a beautiful story, but there are tensions in it. There are two types of tensions in the story. There are internal tensions, but there are also external tensions. Now remember, the Gospel of Matthew was written after Mark and after the fall of Jerusalem. So for that community, the problem of the Empire of Rome, the Roman Empire, was real. Their community lived not far from where a Roman legion was permanently stationed. So the prospect or the threat of violence was ever real for this community. There were also tensions within the community about the style of leadership that should be taken up by the people living in this context. So here we have this artistic creation, this entrance narrative, initially told in the Gospel of Mark, which is now taken up by Matthew. And Matthew makes a few small changes, and those changes are there to emphasise that in contrast to violent options, in contrast to the way of empires and their theology of entitlement, Jesus lives and practices a politics of compassion. Right throughout the Gospel of Matthew, there's a theme of love. It surfaces in the Sermon on the Mount. It comes beautifully together in chapter 22 when Jesus is asked about what's the most significant commandment. Love holds the gospel together, and the work of love is none other than compassion. And at that point, Jesus is more concerned about the practice of compassion than doctrine or theology. This is the decisive thing about the ministry of Jesus. And in a sense, it's his commitment to this politics of compassion which disturbed the Romans. For shortly after this account, Jesus is crucified by the Romans using a Roman form of execution which was reserved for traitors or subversives. Subversive like Jesus. Once again, we see this tension. We saw it in the first instance in the story of Trump and Jesus going to a bar. Two very different styles. The theology of entitlement, the politics of compassion. This tension is very much present in the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus is bringing a new style, a new way of living, a new way of acting, and it is premised upon the ethics and the practice of compassion. Now, it's worth just noting that the Jewish word for compassion that was used in the Gospel of Matthew doesn't mean simply empathy. Empathy is a good word, but compassion in this sense is deeper. It's more visceral. The Jewish word has to do with a kind of gut response to the agony of somebody else. It's a situation where we're deeply moved by their suffering, and it's almost the only response we can give is a kind of a cry of the heart or a lament about the predicament that we find this person or that community in. Now, at the moment, the whole darn world is in the middle of a crisis, and it is a very fearful time. Most of us are trying to find ways of coping with daily life, ranging from watching all the news broadcasts incessantly, as though there's some detail about the COVID virus that we've missed at this stage. And then on the other hand, resuming normal activities to try and forget about all that. But the suffering is real, and so is the fear. One of the high points for most of us, though, are these spontaneous or unsolicited acts of compassion. That is, when someone has been moved by the plight or suffering of another, and unexpectedly, at their own expense, they take a risk on the other. Now, these gestures of compassion, these acts of love, are so precious. They're precious not only in themselves, but they start to build community. Now, we're all hoping that in 6 to 8 months we start to see changes in the patterns of the effects of the pandemic. Who knows? But most of us are certainly convinced that in 12 months' time it's going to be a very different world. What Palm Sunday does for us, and this is this political reading of the story, this ethical reading of the story, it starts to get us to think about the kind of world that we want to enter. It challenges us to question our values, to look at the way that we act. And what I'm suggesting today is that the ministry of Jesus, the way he interacted with others, these random gestures of compassion we see, they represent a platform or a lifestyle that we can build on. These simple gestures of compassion are not only life-giving for the recipient, they are also for the giver, and they create community. In the months to come, I would hope, regardless of our perspective, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist or believer, Democrat or Republican, Liberal or Labour, regardless of our persuasion, our common plight, our shared humanity, the crisis that we fail will bind us together and make us one, build us a community. And what I'm suggesting today is that when we look at the ministry of Jesus and his politics of compassion, we see not only a sentiment, but also a praxis and a lifestyle which is healing and which is building. Trump and Jesus went into a bar, and in many ways they expressed the tension of the world that we all know. And Trump was speechless when the question was raised about compassion. What I'm suggesting today is that arguably at this point in time, that's the only question that matters. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer, Amen. I'd like to conclude now with a simple reflection. God for everyone. The world has been infected by fear, and yet we try to live each day with dignity. In spite of everything, we choose to live by faith. God of grace, hear our prayer. God for everyone, as we enter Holy Week, in different places we are united by the same Spirit. Give us new wisdom about ourselves and our world. Enable us to follow your ethics of love and the practice of justice. God of grace, hear our prayer. God for everyone, we thank you for Jesus our friend. On Palm Sunday he proclaimed a new order. Subverting emperors and bullies, he brought a new way of being and connecting, steeped in love, expressed in compassion and fulfilled in justice. God of grace, hear our prayer. God for everyone, the world longs for community. Encourage connections, foster deep connections, transcending race, religion, sexuality and gender, making us a global community of friends. God of grace, hear our prayer. God for everyone, teach us to go gently on ourselves and with each other, step by step, day by day, and living by a deeper faith, living out the ethics of love and the practice of justice. God of grace, hear our prayer.